Hey there, hey there, hey there, hey there. Okay, today I would like to talk, now that we have that out of the way, about nib materials. This topic was suggested to me by a viewer. I thought it was a very interesting topic and I gave it a lot of thought because unfortunately there are a lot of ins and outs here. Here's what I want to do. I want to first talk through nib materials without any visual appeal. I'm sorry, all you have to look at is this gorgeous face. After that, I'll tilt the camera down. I'll show you a number of different nibs, different materials, gold, steel, different carats of gold, titanium, what have you, palladium. But before we do that, I do think it is good to have a bit of a theoretical discussion. So if you see me looking down, that's because that's where my notes are, all right? Realistically, there only are a few big nib manufacturers in the world. There is B.R.E and there is JOWO, both in Germany. And then there is also Schmidt, but I was at some point told that Schmidt is actually a subsidiary of one of these two. I thought B.R.E. I could be completely wrong. If someone could affirm this for me in the comments, I will be very grateful and I'll send you a 149. I won't send you a 149, but I will be very grateful. So those are the big nib manufacturers, and many companies, pen companies, that use stock nibs. Think of, for example, Leonardo, big company, uses stock nibs. They come from B.R.E or JOWO. And this applies to many others. Benu uses Schmidt. Visconti, I think, for the longest time used to use B.R.E. So, in other words, a lot of these pen companies that don't make their own nibs will revert to B.R.E or JOWO or Schmidt. Some manufacturers of pens make their nibs in-house. Montblanc is a famous example, but there are other companies that do it as well. For example, Aurora, that's a good one that makes their own nibs in-house, and there are many others, but I don't have an exhaustive list here. I'm sure that exists online, but just so you know, some companies do make their nibs in-house. Now, to some people that's a really big deal. Others don't care so much. I once addressed that in a Consult the Doctor episode. You can find an index of those with topics on my website if you want to dive into that more. But because I have the feeling this is going to be a relatively long video anyway, I'll just gloss over that issue and really try to stay on focus about the materials. When it comes to nib materials, I really think there only is a handful of options. A nib can be steel. When we say steel, we mean stainless steel, a specific type of alloy that is relatively resistant to corrosion. After all, a nib is in contact with liquid all the time, right? Ink. So in other words, if that would rust very quickly, that would be a problem. You do find non-stainless steel nibs, so just steel, as dip nibs. People who do calligraphy use those nibs and they will corrode over time. They will rust and then you replace them. But those you can buy when you're not talking about vintage, very fancy nibs, for a couple dollars a box, so to speak. So that's not so bad. But a fountain pen, that's a different story. You don't want to change out nibs all the time. So we have stainless steel, then we have gold. We also have gold plated, which is typically a stainless steel nib with a gold plating on top of it, but that's different from a solid gold nib, which is made of gold, right? I always think solid is a little misleading, but I'll get to that in just a second. So a stainless steel nib with gold plating on top, or a nib made mostly out of actual gold, and then you have titanium and palladium. Those, I would say, are the sort of big five options where gold plated is not a material in its own regard, it's just a combination of two materials. Now, gold plated, as I just said, that really is just that. It is very thin gold plating that is fused onto a nib of a different material. Again, typically steel. That is different from solid gold, because solid gold is a nib that is made primarily out of gold, right? That doesn't have gold sort of electroplated or whatever on top of another material, but that actually is made of gold. Now, you can get gold nibs that look like gold, yellow gold. You can also get gold nibs that look like something else. For example, Yardeled makes pens out of silver, and therefore plates the nibs with something that I was once told many years ago by the CEO of Yardeled that's actually nickel, so that the nib has the same color as the pen. Otherwise you have a silver pen and a yellow gold nib, which may look a little dissonant to some. And so there are other materials as well. Rhodium is a famous one. Rhodium plated nibs look like silver, are not silver, but look like silver. And then you also have ruthenium, which is a much darker coating. It makes the nib look almost black. And then there are other things. You could have rose gold, but I would say those are the main nib platings. Very rarely you see platinum plated nibs, but I find that fairly rare. And of course you can combine things. You have two-tone nibs that have yellow gold as well as rhodium plating, so you have two colors on the nib. It's a bit fancier. Okay, so that type of plating you would find on solid gold nibs, right? Then you have primarily yellow gold nib, and it has a plating on it to match the color of the trims of the pen, for example the clip or a center band or something like that. Now I think the next thing we should discuss is carats of gold, and what that means. I'm certainly not a goldsmith, but when I started off in fountain pens I was very puzzled by, and that may just be a lacune in my education, but in any case I was very puzzled by 14 karat or 18 karat or 21 karat. What's the difference? And the difference is relatively simple when someone points it out to you, but in a nutshell, think of it this way. Pure gold, like if you would make a nib entirely out of gold with not a single other metal in it, so not an alloy, just pure gold, that would be 24 carats of gold. That is entirely solid gold with nothing else in it. But that has a couple of issues. It's relatively expensive because gold is expensive, and more importantly for fountain pen users, gold is so soft. Same reason, by the way, you can't make nibs out of silver, even though I once said that in a very old video. Go look back to my thousands of videos and find that one. Gold is so soft, pure gold, that if you would make a nib out of pure gold, the tines would just bend out of shape and the nib would be ruined. So typically manufacturers create an alloy where they do that. They create an alloy where they put other metals into the mix of gold as well. Now the carat refers to how much gold is in that nib. So you cannot have a gold-plated nib of 14 karat or something. That's not really how that works. But you can have a solid gold nib of 14 carats or 18 carats, and that just indicates how much gold was used in that specific alloy. Now when you do the math, for example, for 14 carats of gold, 14 divided by 24 times 100, and then you get a percentage, you would get 58.3, right? So the gold content in a 14 karat gold nib is 58.3%. Now having said that, 0.3% is hard to work with, so typically what manufacturers do is they put in 58.5% of gold. 0.5% is easier to work with than 0.3, and as a result you will find gold nibs that are stamped with 14K, and then often below it or to the side or whatever there will also be an indication that says 585, and that is that gold content, 58.5%, a slight roundup from 58.3. Now, not all gold nibs have it, don't worry if yours does not. Some regions require that to happen, other regions do not, but so I wouldn't worry about it too much, but that's 14 karat. If you do the same math for 18 carats, 18 divided by 24 times 100, then you get a percentage and you would yield 75%. So in other words, an 18 karat gold nib has more gold in it than a 14 karat gold nib. 14 karat, 58.5, 18 karat, 75% gold. And then finally, Sailor, Japanese pen company, actually creates nibs that are 21 karat gold. And 21 karat gold would be a very high gold content, it's 87.5%. That is as high as it gets. I have never seen a 22, 23 karat gold nib. I'm assuming because that gets too soft. Now, that varies a little bit as to the material used. For example, Visconti used to have palladium nibs, and those were actually 23 karat palladium. So that was almost solid. I couldn't come up with the name anymore. Palladium, right? It was almost solid palladium. 24 karat is the max, 23 karat is almost solid palladium. that's it. I think these alloys are important because they are part of what determines the bounciness of a nib. There is a misunderstanding, in my mind it's a misunderstanding, that gold nibs will be softer, so in other words under pressure the tines open up a bit more than steel nibs. First of all, be very careful when you do that, because I get a lot of comments from people who say, I try to flex my Pelican M1000, now the nib is sprung. That's because that nib is not a flex nib. Unless a nib is advertised as a flex nib, you really shouldn't be exerting much pressure on it. It's not meant to be used that way. Having said that, I think this is a myth that gold will always be softer than steel. And here's a simple empirical observation. My first solid gold nib, 14 karat gold, was on a Visconti Opera Elements, and that is a very soft nib. It actually has a bit of spring to it. With some pressure the tines do open up a bit. Then I purchased, not long after that, a Platinum 3776 music nib, 3 tines, 2 slits, and I thought maybe some line variation. Well, you do get line variation because it's a fairly wide nib, a bit like a stub, right? I also have a video on different kinds of nibs like stubs and italics and obliques, but I want to skip on that today. This is just the material of the nibs. That Platinum nib was actually very rigid. Those tines do not open, even with substantial pressure, which again, you shouldn't do. I'm just explaining this for educational purposes. Those nibs would not open. Sorry, those tines would not open. And both of those are 14 karat gold nibs. So then what does determine the flexibility of a nib? Well, I'm sure that the gold content matters a bit. Gold is soft, and yet I found a lot of 14 karat gold nibs to be softer than 18 karat gold nibs, which have more gold in them. But having said that, I think another aspect that's very important, maybe more important, is the geometry of the nib. A nib, right, has tines that end in tipping. That tipping is usually a very hard material. So even if you have a solid gold nib, that tipping will not be solid gold because that would be too soft. That would wear out too quickly when you write on paper. A very hard metal. That tipping has its own geometry that is cut in a certain way and polished in a certain way, but the tines, those 2 or 3 in some music nibs cases, those tines have a geometry as well. They can be fairly short and stocky, or they can be relatively long, and they can be narrower, or they can be wider. That matters a lot, because I've found that longer, thinner tines, and this intuitively kind of makes sense, have much more flexibility to them, have much more softness to them, I should say, than very stocky, shorter tines or wider tines. And that makes sense. The material is thinner and therefore it'll respond more under pressure. He took a deep breath and thought about what else he should talk about. I've now talked about stainless steel. I've talked about solid gold as well as stainless steel plated with gold or other platings, rhodium, ruthenium, for example. I've talked a little bit about palladium nibs. Well, they're made of palladium, which is another precious metal. You also have titanium nibs. And titanium nibs, this kind of ties into the story I was just telling about flexibility within nibs. Titanium nibs tend to be really quite soft. With some pressure, the tines open up quite strongly. I'll show you that later when I do a writing sample. The issue with titanium nibs, though, is that people treat them as flex nibs. They can be pushed a little bit, but they don't really give you any warning as to when you're pushing them too far, and then a nib may be sprung. In other words, that just simply means that the tines splay out like this, and at that point a nib could be ruined. A nibmeister can often bend them back in shape, but it always remains a soft, what do you call that, a weak spot. So you have to be very careful with that. With gold nibs, again, people treat gold nibs as if they're flex nibs sometimes. They're not. But often you can get a little bit of character out of a nib, but with a titanium nib you can push it quite hard. People get tempted to push them really far and they will open up really far, but then they don't snap back. And gold kind of gives you a warning sign of, for example, with vintage nibs that tend to have a lot of softness to them, you kind of get a warning sign of, okay, that's about as far as I should push it. Beyond this might get a little dangerous. Titanium doesn't give you any feedback. It just stays sprung and doesn't snap back. So that's always something to be a little aware of. Okay, I just want to check my notes here to see what else I had to talk about. When it comes to flex and stainless steel nibs, a lot of modern flex nibs, think for example of Noodlers, think of Fountain Pen Revolution, are typically stainless steel nibs, but they tend to be much thinner. So the steel used is much thinner, and as a result the tines also open up more easily. Also often take a bit more pressure than vintage nibs, but I don't want to devote too much of this video talking about flex because that's a whole different story altogether. Okay, I have done the titanium. I couldn't read my own handwriting because I wrote in between two rather fill lines. I thought it said way zoning, but it actually says warning. That's the warning for the titanium. Then we have, I think that's the last thing I will say, so what about wetness? Some nibs are simply wetter than other. Well, that's a function of a number of things. There is the feed. How well does the feed supply ink to the nib? It also depends on the ink you're using and the paper you're using. Super absorbent paper will not make any pen seem wet because the ink just gets sucked into the paper. So there is that. Then we have there's the feed, the ink, the paper. There's even, I think, a little bit of the climate you're in. It's very humid, it's very dry, etc. But another very important aspect is the tines of the nib, in my mind, should just not touch. If you look at the tines under a loupe, you should see something, I'm exaggerating here, but something like this. So they have an opening that's wider near the breather hole, or at least near the ink reservoir, that narrows down, and the tips of the two tines should just not touch. The wider open they are, while maintaining that taper towards the nib tip, the wetter the nib will be. But at some point, a nib will splay. When the tines are out too far, when they point away from each other, then that nib is sprung. Ink flow is hampered because ink has to flow up this way. That hampers capillary action, which is what's sucking the ink out of your pen to begin with. You do want the tines to be going towards each other at least. And then there are different schools of thoughts. Some nib experts say the tips of the tine should just touch, and others say they should not. I find that my pens where they just not touch write the most pleasant because they're a little wetter. Okay, this was a lot of talk and I apologize, but this is how I wanted to address the issue initially of discussing nib materials. The most important thing, I think, is to have reasonable expectations. If you are building up your collection of fountain pens, if you're moving from stainless steel nibs to gold nibs, have reasonable expectations. Do not think choirs of angels will start to sing when you start to use a gold nib, because you'll probably be disappointed. A good gold nib is certainly nice, but so is a good steel nib. So be reasonable in your expectations. And finally, please bear in mind the huge variance between nib types, nib materials, and even within materials. You can have a 14K nib that is very soft and bouncy and a 14K nib that is rigid as a nail. And there is really, in my mind, no true predicting what the nib will be like beyond looking at the shape of the tines. But that's a more advanced thing. Personally, I get a pen and I see how it writes. And I don't have any expectations, I just look at how the nib writes. That's it. Let's have a pragmatic look at a number of different nib materials. Let's do it now. Alright, so I have prepared a, what is it, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 pens. I want to keep this somewhat manageable and not like a 5-hour video. Let's start off with this pen and I'll show you the contrast with this one. This is a Fountain Pen Revolution pen. This is a stainless steel nib and it looks like steel, right? This is a silver colored steel. I did not ink this up. It's also a flex nib. It has these cutouts, has an ebonite feed, and it's pretty flexy. I haven't inked this up because I had this pen inked up, and I'm going to tell you right now, I have different inks in the pens. I'm sorry, I know that's not good experimentation, but they're different branded nibs anyway, and I kind of just want to talk you through the experience, bearing in mind, as I said, that there is a lot of variance within nibs. So here we have a Magna Carta Elements pen. This is the Earth, and this is a steel nib. This looks to me like it's gold plated because it clearly looks like gold, but it is at no point marked as 14K or 18K. Therefore it is a steel nib. It would require that marking for me to know this is an actual gold nib. Okay, so we first noticed that it doesn't write, but there we go. Magna Carta. I made this nib a little bit wetter, but I have found that a good steel nib, and this certainly is one, is or can be quite smooth, very pleasant to use, reasonable wetness. This is B.R.E. brown ink, by the way. Relatively rigid, as this is my property, I try to push that a little bit. You see there is some line variation possible. Okay, again, be very careful. This is not advertised as a flex nib. I move up. I have here a Leonardo. This is the Furore Grande. This is an ebonite feed, which I think the Magna Carta has as well. And this is a 14 karat gold nib. Now the first thing you see, it's a nice overcast day here, so I have a nice gray sky over there that I can reflect. This does not look like yellow gold. If you compare that to the Magna Carta, you can immediately tell one is gold and one is gold colored, I should say, and one is not. So this is interesting because this is a solid gold nib. It does say 14K 585 and it's a broad nib. So in other words, here we have, I probably should have marked this, shouldn't I? Just fits. Steel, but gold plated. Okay, now we have a 14K gold AU. Sometimes you see AU. What is it again? Aurum, which is gold. This is a Leonardo Furore Grande. I'm not going to bother with the model names. The ink here is the nice humble Waterman, what used to be South Sea Blue, and I don't know what it is now, but it is the Waterman Turquoise. Jumps lazy. I know this is not a sentence, I'm trying to stick to the same length of writing. A broad nib, quite nice, a little stubby in nature. Fascinating pen too. Now that was 14 karat gold. I thought then we could move on to 18 karat gold. Here we have a Lambru Pens LB6, and this pen has a 18 karat solid gold nib, but with rhodium plating to match the silver trim of the pen. This is a number 8 nib. Number 8 nib is bigger than the number 6 nib. The diameter of the feed in this case is 6 millimeters, and there it's 8 millimeters. I dedicated a video to that if you want to check up on nib sizes. But here we have 18 karat. This is Lambru Pens. And this is a medium nib that in my mind kind of writes like a fine, to be honest. It's definitely not a very broad, wide line. Jumps lazy. Done. So what I've noticed is I feel more rigidness in the steel nib, and it gets a little bit softer here in feel. It feels a little bit bouncier, and this one feels somewhat more rigid again. Now this is a really unfair nib to put in here, but I didn't have any other sailors. This is a Classic Pens, same brand as this before it got renamed. Classic Pens LB5, but as you can see, it says Sailor there. This pen was made by Sailor, and it does have a Sailor nib, This is a 21 karat gold nib, but it's a very special nib. As you can see, it's two nibs welded on top of each other called a cross point, which makes for a very wide, broad nib. This ink was Mont Blanc corn poppy, and so is this. But this is a very, very wide nib. So this, yeah, this is a very classic P for pens. This is a very unfair comparison, especially I can't even write this small with it, because this is super, super wet. This is an absolute joy to use. What I will say is the typical 21 karat nibs have a bit of feedback. That's a sailor thing. I'm not going to push this. Hello. This is quite smooth, but that's because it has so much tipping material down there. Anyway, I didn't have any other 21 karat gold nibs, so I couldn't show you that nib with anything else. In general terms, I have found that 21 karat gold nibs by Sailor typically have quite a bit of feedback, as I said, but more than that, I have also found that they are typically very, very rigid, which again might be a bit counterintuitive. You might think that, you know, 21 karat gold therefore must be a bit softer. I've actually found them to be really quite rigid typically. Okay, here we have a Visconti Speakeasy. This has a 23 karat Palladium nib. So this is 23K PD for Palladium. This is a Visconti 1.5 millimeter stub nib, and these nibs I have found are very, very smooth, which is a very pleasant experience to write with. This one is not super springy, but no, actually no, it's not bad. Some of the Palladium nibs came in generations. Some were very springy, others were very rigid. This one is on the springier end, but it's already a 1.5 millimeter italic, so already has a very broad line to begin with. I thought it was it 1.1? No, 1.3. I was going to say that doesn't look like 1.5. Sorry about that. 1.3. The final nib I have is on this 3D printed pen made by my friend William Shakur. This has a number 8 titanium nib on it. So steel can have some, I mean, every type of nib can have some feedback. That's what I mean by a lot of variance too. But in any case, steel can have quite a bit of feedback. These nibs, 14, 18, 21 karat gold, did not have much feedback. This one had the most, the 18K, but that's also, relatively speaking, the finest of these 3 gold nibs. And then here, the Palladium was very smooth. Titanium looks typically dull. It looks a sort of gunmetal gray. You can have anodized titanium nibs that have different colors. If you look at my personal pens videos, I had a Stipula Etruria Magnifica, which I ended up selling, that had a sort of dull gold looking titanium nib. So there is always that as an option. This is untreated titanium. It's also unbranded, but it is a B.R.E nib, and I almost have no space left. But this would be TI for titanium, and this is William Shakur, who I think calls his company is now Titan Pens. I will shut up and I'll let you listen, because you can hear the feedback typically. These titanium nibs really have quite a bit of feedback. Both of these pens, the Visconti and the Titan, were inked with Waterman Serenity Blue. So just the standard washable blue. Now the real trick in the titanium, I am being a bit careful here, and this is very wet. Let me see if I can dry out the feed a little bit. Take some of the ink out. the real fun in a titanium nib is that flexibility. So there's no issue with that amount of line variation, and I know this nib fairly well. Bit of railroading there. That's about as far as I'm willing to push it, but as you can see, that leaves quite a bit of line variation. So titanium nibs are a lot of fun as long as you're okay with quite a bit of feedback, and as long as you are careful. Don't push them too far. I can squeeze this harder than that, but I know that I risk springing the nib, and I don't want that. So you do need to really develop sense and sensibility, as they say. Okay, I hope this was useful. I hope I've not bored you to death. I've not shown you any specifically treated nibs, although as I said, like this is rhodium plated and such. I simply don't, like, there's a lot, yellow, gold and all that. At the end of the day, remember that this steel may very well have the same type of metal touching the paper as this 14 karat gold nib, because it's probably the same very hard metal that makes up the tipping of these nibs. And that, I think, is another thing that beginning pen users should take to heart. Don't be upset. Some people, because they contact me and say, I feel bad because I don't have a gold nib and etc. But bear in mind, at the end of the day, it used to be iridium, and when iridium got a little rare, we've started to use other metals. It's probably the same material on your nib that is actually touching the page as on this 21 karat gold nib. So don't feel bad, everything is fine. Never apologize for the pens you own, it's all good. Okay? Just have fun with your pens. I hope this was useful. I certainly like the progression in color. I know it should have all been the same ink and all that, but I try to really talk you through the experience. I hope I've not failed at that. I hope I haven't bored you to death. If you have any other things you would like me to show like this, please go ahead and let me know. Thank you so much for watching. I'll let you go now because I feel like we've been here for a decade. Bye!